It happened on my father's 60th birthday, right in front of more than 50 guests packed into our family's grand living room. The chandeliers glowed, the champagne glasses sparkled, and for a moment it felt like we were celebrating something that actually mattered. But then, with a smirk curling across his face, my father raised his glass and announced, "You're adopted, Elias, so I removed your name from my will." The room erupted into laughter. Some of my relatives doubled over, clapping each other on the back as if this humiliation was part of the entertainment. My younger brother Victor chuckled the loudest, his smug grin pointed directly at me. My sister Clara shook her head with mock pity, leaning closer to whisper something to a cousin who laughed even harder. My father basked in the attention, enjoying every cruel second of it. The only person not laughing was my mother, Marian. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the tablecloth as if holding herself steady against a storm. Her eyes darted toward me, full of silent apology, but she said nothing. She never challenged him in public, not even when the target was me. I stood there, staring at all of them. My chest burned, but not with shame. They expected me to shrink, to walk out humiliated. Instead, I walked forward through the laughter, every step deliberate. The room quieted as I reached the long banquet table where the gifts were displayed. Without saying a word, I placed mine on the polished surface. It wasn't wrapped in bright paper or tied with a ribbon. It was a single envelope. Dozens of eyes followed me as I slid it into the center, then tore it straight down the middle. The paper ripped clean in my hands. I kept tearing until the pieces were nothing more than scraps scattered across the tablecloth. Then I stepped back, my face calm, while the silence of confusion spread across the room. "What the hell was that?" my father barked, suddenly unsure. He tried to keep his confident tone, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. The same people who had been laughing seconds ago now stared at the shredded pieces, curiosity replacing their cruelty. I looked him in the eye and answered in a voice steady enough for everyone to hear. "That was my gift to you." I grew up in a house where wealth was measured not just by money, but by pride, appearances, and bloodlines. My father, Richard, built his reputation on those values. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman, a man who had built his empire with determination and clever deals. To me, he was a man who never let me forget that I was adopted. When I was younger, I tried to ignore the way he treated me compared to my siblings. My brother Victor, 2 years younger than me, carried my father's sharp jawline and confident stride. My sister Clara, older by 3 years, had inherited my father's cunning smile and his way of commanding a room. They were his pride. He loved introducing them at parties, praising their achievements and boasting about their bright futures. With me, things were different. He never introduced me as his son. When he had to, he would emphasize the word adopted, as if it were a warning label. At family dinners, he often skipped over my accomplishments, even though I worked harder than Victor and Clara combined. When I received a scholarship for college, he congratulated me with the same dry tone he used when thanking the waiter for refilling his wine glass. My mother, Marian, was the only anchor I had in that house. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and always tried to shield me from the sharp edges of my father's cruelty. She was not my biological mother either, but she never let me feel like an outsider. She would slip into my room at night when I was younger, sit on the edge of my bed, and whisper, "You are mine, Elias. Blood has nothing to do with it." Those words carried me through years of being overlooked, ridiculed, and treated as though I did not belong. But no matter how strong I tried to be, it still stung to sit at the dinner table and watch my father beam at Victor's careless jokes while barely acknowledging my presence. It cut deep when Clara would win a local debate competition and he would host a toast in her honor, while my own achievements in business school went unnoticed. By the time I reached my 30s, I had stopped expecting anything from him. I had built my own career, invested wisely, and made a life for myself without leaning on his wealth or influence. I did not want his money. I only wanted his respect. A sliver of recognition that I was more than just the outsider he enjoyed mocking. When the invitation for his 60th birthday arrived, I almost ignored it. It was written in Clara's polished handwriting, embossed with gold letters and dripping with the kind of extravagance that had always defined our family gatherings. The party was to be held at the family estate, a mansion that stood as Richard's monument to his success. The guest list included extended family, old friends, and business partners. It was not just a birthday party, it was a performance. I hesitated, but Marion called me personally. "Please come, Elias," she said softly. "It would mean the world to me to have you there. Your father, well, he is set in his ways, but you are still his son, no matter what he says. Just be there for me." Her voice carried a weight I could not ignore. She had been my protector for as long as I could remember, and if she asked this of me, I would go. I promised myself I would stay calm no matter what my father threw at me. On the day of the party, I arrived early. The house glowed with chandeliers. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided across the floor with trays of champagne, and laughter already filled the rooms. I walked past portraits of Richard, oil paintings of him, shaking hands with politicians, posing in front of his first company, and smiling with Victor and Clara at milestones. Not one photograph on those walls included me. Marion greeted me at the door. She hugged me tightly, her perfume carrying the familiar scent of lavender. "You look handsome," she said with pride, adjusting my tie as if I were still a boy. Behind her, I could see Richard speaking with Victor near the bar. His booming laugh filled the room. Clara stood close by, sipping champagne, her sharp eyes scanning the guests like a hawk searching for prey. Marion whispered, "Promise me, Elias, that you will not let him get under your skin tonight. Just smile, nod, and let the evening pass." For me, I nodded, though a part of me knew that no matter how much I tried to avoid it, my father would find a way to make me the target of his cruelty. That was the role he had written for me in this family drama, and he played his part with relish. As the evening went on, I mingled politely, exchanged handshakes, and listened to the hollow compliments of relatives who barely knew me. The air smelled of expensive wine and roasted lamb, but beneath the surface it reeked of something else: power, control, and the constant reminder that this was Richard's stage, and we were all there to applaud him. I carried a small envelope in my pocket, my gift for my father. Unlike the luxury watches and rare wines piled high on the gift table, mine was simple, understated, but more valuable than anything else in the room. I had chosen it carefully, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Despite everything, I had wanted to give him something that mattered. As I stood there watching him hold court with his friends, basking in the glow of his self-importance, I felt the weight of that envelope pressing against my chest. I did not know then how quickly everything would change, or how that simple piece of paper would bring his empire of arrogance crashing down in front of everyone he sought to impress. The speeches began after dinner. The waiters cleared the plates, the clinking of silverware faded, and the room quieted in anticipation. Everyone knew that my father loved nothing more than holding the spotlight, and his birthday was the perfect excuse. He stood near the head of the long banquet table, his glass raised high, his chest puffed out as if the entire night had been built around his greatness. He tapped the glass lightly, silencing the scattered whispers and laughter. 60 years, he began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man used to being listened to. 60 years of hard work, of building a family, of creating a legacy worth remembering. The guests clapped politely, nodding with admiration. Some raised their glasses in return, already caught up in his rhythm. Victor leaned back in his chair, grinning, proud to be seated closest to him. Clara rested a hand on his shoulder, eyes shining as though she were basking in borrowed glory. Marion sat stiffly, her smile thin and brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. My father's speech rolled on, filled with stories about his early business ventures, his triumphs over competitors, and his determination to leave behind an empire that would endure long after him. Each story was punctuated by laughter from the audience and approving nods from relatives eager to stay in his good graces. Then his tone shifted. He lowered his glass slightly and smirked. "But what is legacy without blood?" His words were sharp, designed to pierce. He let them hang in the air before continuing. "A man's legacy belongs to his children, those who carry his name, his spirit, and most importantly, his blood." A ripple of agreement spread through the room, heads nodding, smiles widening. My stomach tightened. I knew where this was going. He turned his eyes on me, locking me in his gaze like a hunter cornering prey. "Which brings me to a decision I have made." He paused for effect, relishing the silence, then declared with cruel satisfaction, "My adopted son, Elias, will not be included in my will. Legacy cannot be passed through paperwork. It must run in the blood." For a second, the room went silent. Then the laughter came, loud, cruel, unrestrained. Guests chuckled into their glasses. A few slapped the table as if it were the funniest thing they had ever heard. Victor laughed the hardest, clapping his father on the back and saying loudly, "Good one, Dad." "About time you made it clear," Clara smirked and shook her head as though she had always expected this outcome. Heat rushed to my face, but not from shame. It was anger, hot and steady, burning through me. I watched them laugh at me, laugh at the life I had lived in this family, laugh at the years I had tried to prove myself. My fists clenched under the table, but I refused to give them what they wanted. They wanted me humiliated. They wanted me broken. Marion did not laugh. She sat frozen, her hand gripping the stem of her wineglass so tightly I thought it might snap. Her eyes filled with tears, but she kept them down, refusing to let them spill in front of the crowd. She glanced at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and apology, silently begging me not to react in anger. Inside, a storm raged. Every insult, every dismissal, every time my father had introduced me as the adopted one instead of his son, crashed through my mind. This was his final act, his public declaration that I did not belong, and he wanted the world to celebrate it. The laughter continued, echoing off the high ceilings, filling the ornate room with cruelty. Some guests looked uncomfortable but laughed anyway, unwilling to stand against Richard's authority. I caught the eye of an old family friend, a man who had known me since I was a boy. He looked away quickly, ashamed to be caught enjoying the spectacle. I could have walked out. That would have been the easiest choice. Leave them to their celebration of blood and wealth. Let them believe they had pushed me aside for good. But something inside me hardened. I would not leave quietly, not tonight. I pushed my chair back and stood. The laughter faltered as I walked toward the long banquet table where the gifts were piled high. My footsteps echoed in the sudden hush. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Victor stopped laughing, his grin slipping as he watched me. My father raised his chin, trying to look unbothered, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And where do you think you're going?" he called out, his voice still mocking, but thinner now, strained under the weight of the silence pressing down on the room. I ignored him. My focus was on the small envelope in my hand, the gift I had brought for him. It was plain, unadorned, but it carried more value than any of the extravagant presents stacked on the table. I set it down carefully in the center, the sound of paper against wood unnaturally loud in the stillness. Dozens of eyes followed me as I straightened. Without a word, I took the envelope, held it up high so everyone could see it, and then tore it cleanly down the middle. Gasps rose from the crowd. I kept tearing, splitting the paper into smaller and smaller pieces, letting them fall like snow across the polished surface of the table. When I finished, I let the scraps scatter from my hands and turned back to face my father. The laughter was gone now, replaced by whispers of confusion. Richard's smirk had vanished. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what I had just destroyed. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice sharp, edged with the first signs of fear. What the hell did you just tear up in front of everyone? I met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I felt no fear of him. My voice was steady, clear enough for every guest in the room to hear. That was my gift to you. A heavy silence followed. The same people who had laughed at me minutes earlier now leaned forward in curiosity, wondering what they had just witnessed. My father's face hardened, but behind his bravado, I saw the first cracks. He did not know yet what he had lost, but he would soon. The scraps of my gift still lay scattered across the table, fluttering slightly from the draft of the air conditioning. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead. I could feel every eye in the room on me. Some were wide with shock, others narrowed with curiosity. The laughter that had filled the house moments earlier had died completely, leaving behind a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. My father broke the silence first. "Elias," he said, slowly, his voice dropping lower. "What did you just do?" His expression was no longer smug. His forehead furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time that evening he looked uncertain. I stood tall, letting him stew in the discomfort. "I gave you my gift," I answered calmly, "and I made sure you could never keep it." A murmur rippled through the guests. Heads turned. Whispers filled the edges of the room. People shifted in their chairs, their curiosity sharp, hungry to know what I had meant. Victor leaned forward, scoffing loudly to cover his unease. "Oh, please," he sneered. "What could you possibly give that would matter here?" "Dad doesn't need anything from you. This is just another one of your little attention grabs." Clara smirked, tilting her head with that same superior glare she had mastered since childhood. Pathetic, really. Even at his birthday, you still make it about yourself. I ignored them both. They had always played their roles as my father's loyal shadows, echoing his cruelty and basking in the approval it brought them. My words weren't for them. They were for Richard. My father stepped closer to the table, his eyes narrowing at the pile of torn paper. He tried to sound commanding, but there was a faint quiver in his tone. "Pick that up and explain yourself." Right now, I shook my head. "No, Dad. You wanted to show everyone tonight that I don't belong. You wanted to humiliate me in front of the people you care about most. But what you don't realize is that I came prepared." Gasps rose from the crowd. A woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand. A man whispered something urgently to the guest beside him. The tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer entertainment. It was confrontation, and no one wanted to miss a second of it. Marion's eyes brimmed with tears as she looked at me. She reached a trembling hand toward me as if she wanted to stop me, but she didn't speak. She had spent years keeping peace, but in this moment she understood something had changed. Richard's jaw tightened. "Prepared for what?" he demanded. I met his gaze without flinching. "Prepared for you. Prepared for this night. You can laugh, you can cut me out of your will, you can tell the world that blood is everything, but you cannot erase what I just destroyed." A fresh wave of murmurs surged through the room. Victor frowned, finally beginning to sense that something was wrong. "What was in that envelope?" he asked, his voice less certain now. I let the silence stretch, watching the unease spread like fire through the crowd. My father's friends, once smiling and laughing at his jokes, now leaned forward in their chairs, anxious to see the truth revealed. Business partners shifted uncomfortably, aware that this spectacle was not the image of control Richard had hoped to project. "Finally," I said, "that was a legal document. A transfer of ownership. Something valuable, something you would have cherished. Something I wanted you to have." I paused, locking eyes with my father. But I tore it up, and with it, I tore away the only gift in this room that truly mattered. The color drained slightly from his face. He took a step closer to the table, staring down at the shreds as if he might recognize the document simply from the paper stock. His hand twitched, itching to scoop up the pieces, but his pride held him back in front of his guests. Victor's voice cracked as he pressed, "What property? What was it?" His bravado was slipping. He looked from me to our father, realizing for the first time that he might not be the favored child in every way that mattered. Clara crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "He's bluffing." It was nothing. He probably staged this just for drama, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. Richard turned back to me, his voice hoarse now. "Tell me what you destroyed." "Tell me right now." I shook my head again, my voice calm but firm. "You'll find out soon enough. But not because I tell you. Because you'll see it for yourself when you put those pieces together." The tension in the room reached its peak. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to leave, but too captivated to walk away. Others leaned forward, their faces lit with anticipation as if they were watching a play reach its climax. Richard finally snapped. He lunged toward the table, sweeping the scraps into his hands. His movements were frantic, almost desperate. He barked orders at Victor and Clara. "Help me. Find the rest." Now Victor scrambled to obey, bending to pick up the pieces that had fallen to the floor. Clara hesitated, looking around at the guests, embarrassed by the spectacle, but even she crouched down to collect scraps. As they worked, Marion rose quietly from her seat. She walked to my side, her hand brushing my arm gently. Her whisper was barely audible, but I heard it as clearly as if she had shouted, "You are not the weak one here." You never were. I felt a steady strength rise in me. For years, I had been treated as the outsider, the unworthy son. But now, in front of everyone, the balance of power was shifting. My father was no longer the man in control. He was the one scrambling, desperate to piece together what I had torn apart. The guests watched in stunned silence as the mighty Richard, the man who had spent his life commanding respect, bent over a pile of torn paper, his hands shaking as he tried to tape it back together. He had turned my humiliation into his own, and I knew in that moment that whatever came next would not just change how he saw me, it would change everything. My father's hands trembled as he pressed the scraps of paper flat against the table. Victor hovered close, holding a strip of clear tape, frantically trying to piece together the edges. Clara crouched down, smoothing the smaller fragments, her face pale, but determined to maintain her composure. Their movements were hurried, clumsy, and desperate. The same guests who had laughed earlier now sat in complete silence, watching the proud patriarch of the family scramble like a man drowning. The sound of the tape pulling free echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. My father's face glistened with sweat. His jaw tight, his lips moving in muttered curses as he tried to force the torn pieces back into order. His reputation, his authority, his very image of control, all of it was unraveling before the people whose respect he demanded most. Finally, the words began to form again. The jagged strips of paper lined up, revealing black ink on official letterhead. Guests craned their necks, murmuring as they realized what he was holding. My father stopped taping, his eyes scanning the partial sentences, his breath catching as the truth became clear. The document was a deed transfer. Signed, notarized, and legally binding, it had given him ownership of one of my most valuable properties, a commercial building in the heart of the city worth millions. I had intended it as a gesture of respect, a way of showing him that despite everything I still valued him as my father. That envelope had carried more than just a gift. It had carried my attempt at peace. By tearing it apart in front of everyone, I had revoked it. The property was no longer his. He had lost it before he had even known it was his to gain. His face drained of color as the reality struck. His hands froze midair, the taped fragments shaking in his grip. The room erupted in whispers, sharp and urgent. "It was a deed," someone hissed. "He gave him a property." Another voice added, "And now it's gone." Just like that, Victor's mouth fell open. "You were giving him that building?" His voice cracked with disbelief. That was supposed to be ours. He turned on me, fury flooding his expression. You set us up. You planned this to humiliate him. Clara's mask of superiority shattered. She stared at the taped fragments, her jaw slack, her confidence evaporating. For the first time, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. My father's voice broke the murmurs. It was low, hoarse, and stripped of the power he had wielded all night. Why, Elias? Why would you do this? I stepped forward, my voice steady, carrying through the room. Because you never saw me as your son. Tonight, you wanted to make that public. You wanted to cut me out of your will as if I had never been part of this family. So I showed you what it feels like to lose something you thought belonged to you. That building was yours, Dad. I signed it over to you, but I took it back the moment you tried to erase me. Gasps swept the room. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, ashamed of the laughter they had joined earlier. Others sat forward, riveted by the downfall of the man they had admired. Marian's eyes glistened with tears as she reached for me. She did not say anything, but her face shone with pride and sorrow all at once. Richard's hands dropped the taped fragments. They scattered again across the table, useless now. His shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He had spent his life believing his power came from control, wealth, and bloodlines. In one moment, I had ripped that illusion apart. You think this makes you strong? He spat finally, though his voice wavered. You think tearing up a piece of paper changes anything? It changes everything, I replied, because that paper wasn't just property. It was proof that I cared, even after everything you did to me. I wanted you to have something meaningful, something that said, I was still willing to stand by you as your son, but you threw me aside in front of everyone, so I threw away the only chance you had to keep me. The silence that followed was crushing. My words hung heavy in the air, undeniable and final. Victor slammed his fist against the table, his anger spilling over. You ruined everything, he shouted. Do you have any idea what you've done to us? I turned to him calmly. I know exactly what I've done. I've shown you that wealth doesn't buy loyalty, and blood doesn't guarantee love. You wanted me gone, cut out, forgotten. But tonight, it's you who will remember me every time you see what your father lost. Clara said nothing. She sank back into her chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her confidence shattered. Richard stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the broken fragments of the deed. His face was pale, his hands limp at his sides. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth. He had built his world on dominance and appearances, and in one night it had collapsed in front of everyone he sought to impress. Guests began to murmur again, some rising quietly from their seats, unwilling to stay in the presence of a man so thoroughly undone. A few looked at me with respect, others with disbelief, but no one looked at Richard with admiration anymore. I turned toward the door, my decision final. Happy birthday, Dad, I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. Enjoy the gifts from the people who laugh at your cruelty. Mine is gone, just like the respect you thought you still had. As I walked away, I heard chairs scrape, whispers intensify, and the sound of my father collapsing into his seat. The man who had spent his life towering over everyone was left small, powerless, and broken. I left the dining hall with my back straight and my steps steady. Behind me, the whispers followed like a tide. Guests who had come to celebrate Richard's dominance now spoke in hushed tones about his collapse. The man who had laughed at me, who had treated me as a shadow in his own house, had been left pale and shaking in front of his entire world. I did not look back. For the first time in my life, I did not need his reaction to validate my actions. In the foyer, the golden lights of the chandeliers reflected off polished marble. But to me, the house no longer felt like a fortress of intimidation. It was only a building, a shell of Richard's ego, Marian's soft footsteps followed behind me. She caught my arm, her voice trembling but firm. "Elias," she whispered, "I am so proud of you. I wish it had not come to this, but you finally showed him who you are." I turned to her, the woman who had been my anchor all my life. "I did it for myself, Mom. Not to hurt him, but to finally let him see what he threw away." She nodded, her eyes shining. "You always were the strongest one." He just never wanted to admit it. She hugged me tightly, and I let myself hold on, not as the outcast, but as her son, the one she had always loved without conditions. When I walked out into the night, the cool air hit my face like freedom. The estate behind me still glowed with lights, but inside, the party was already falling apart. I knew the stories would spread. The guests would not remember the food or the expensive wine. They would remember Richard scrambling over scraps of paper, his pride torn apart as easily as the deed itself. In the days that followed, the phone calls began. Some relatives reached out, their voices dripping with false sympathy. "Elias, you shouldn't have done that in front of everyone," one aunt said, as though my father's public humiliation of me had been acceptable, but my response had not. I ended those calls quickly. I no longer needed approval from people who had joined in the laughter. Others called with respect, voices low, almost reverent. "You did what no one else could," one of my father's old business partners told me. "You stood up to him. You made him human." They admired the strength I had shown, though I knew admiration was never my goal. I had wanted peace, but if peace was impossible, then truth would have to be enough. Victor avoided me completely. I heard from distant relatives that he had been raging ever since, furious that I had cost him and Clara what he believed was rightfully theirs. To him, the deed represented not just wealth, but status, another inheritance stolen by the brother he never considered equal. Clara, on the other hand, sent a single message. It read, "You made your point. Don't come back here again." I smiled when I read it. I had no intention of returning. My father never called. Weeks passed, then months, and not a word came from him. I knew his pride would not allow him to admit what he had lost. He had built his life on control, and I had shattered that illusion in front of the only audience he cared about. He would rather stew in silence than face me again, but Marian visited me quietly one afternoon. She brought a basket of fresh bread she had baked herself, the same way she used to when I was a boy. She sat at my kitchen table, her hands folded, her face soft with both sadness and peace. "He is not the same," she said. "He sits in his study most nights, staring at the walls. He is not angry, he is smaller. Like the weight of his own choices finally caught up with him." I listened quietly. Part of me felt pity, but another part knew it was not my responsibility to carry his regrets. "He wanted me to be nothing," I said. "Instead, he showed everyone what he truly is." Marian reached for my hand. "You are more than his son. You are your own man, and you proved it without lifting your voice, without lowering yourself to his cruelty. That is what makes you different." Her words stayed with me. For years, I had believed strength meant enduring his scorn, waiting for recognition that never came. But real strength was walking away from his shadow and building a life where my worth did not depend on his approval. In time, I invested more into my own ventures, expanding my businesses and creating opportunities for people who, like me, had once been overlooked. I mentored young men and women who had been told they did not belong, reminding them that family and worth are not defined by bloodlines but by choices and character. Every time I saw one of them succeed, I felt a pride that my father could never understand. The memory of that night never faded. Sometimes I replayed it in my mind, not with bitterness but with clarity. I remembered the cruel laughter, the smug faces of Victor and Clara, the silence of the guests who refused to stand with me. And I remembered how quickly it all changed when I stood my ground and let my actions speak louder than their scorn. The lesson was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Family is not defined by who claims you in their will or whose blood runs in your veins. Family is defined by who loves you, who respects you, and who stands by you when the world tries to push you aside. I had that in Marion. I had that in myself. That was enough. On the day of my father's next birthday, I did not attend. I spent the evening with friends who had become my chosen family, people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. We laughed freely, not at anyone's expense, but in joy and gratitude. And as the candles burned low, I realized I no longer carried the weight of his rejection. That night, I finally understood. Walking away was not losing. It was winning. Because the man who had tried to erase me was the one left hollow, while I was the one who had found freedom. And that is the truth of what happened the night my father tried to erase me. He thought his words could break me, but all they did was set me free. I walked away from that house no longer chasing his approval, no longer craving a place in his shadow. I finally understood that strength is not about being accepted by people who refuse to see your worth. Strength is about standing tall, even when the world tries to tear you down. If my story connected with you, if it made you feel something, then let me ask for one thing. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Tell me what family means to you, or share a moment when you chose yourself over someone's cruelty. And if you want to hear more stories that dig deep into the heart, subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and it helps me keep telling stories that matter.